It is easier to travel the highway of holiness today because of the spiritual sight work that was started hundreds of years ago, long before Babylon the Great fell, long before the road was open for travelers. Now picture this. It's the 16th century. With shovel in hand, you are about to start sight work on the way of holiness. There's a mountain ahead of you, a mountain of ignorance. And you realize that if you're going to start to level that mountain, the first thing you're going to have to do is get the Bible into the hands of the people. For years, the Bible was only in Latin, and mostly educated people could read it. And even some of the clergy only knew enough Latin to conduct church services, but otherwise they couldn't understand it. Well, if you've been to our beautiful museum, some of you have taken a tour recently, you know that translators in many countries risk their freedom and even their lives to put the Bible into the language of the common people. And then printers produced those translations. And some of them used an assumed name because if they got caught printing a Bible, they could be arrested and even worse. So the mountain had to be leveled a shovelful at a time, one Bible at a time to reduce that mountain on the way of holiness. To get the Bible into the hands of the people, William Tyndale arranged to have thousands of copies of his translation smuggled into England in bales of cotton and other goods. This was dangerous. Tyndale's translation was banned in England, and if you merely possessed a copy of the Bible, that could bring you a stint in the Tower of London, or worse. But despite desperate attempts to stop work on the way of holiness, more copies of Tyndale's Bible were printed than the clergy could ever destroy. By the way, you'll be interested in a comment that Tyndale made in his comments on the book of Genesis, 1530 translation of the book of Genesis. He wrote, "Jehovah is God's name. Neither is any creature so called. As oft as thou seest Lord in capital letters, it is in Hebrew, Jehovah." Early on, the name Jehovah was given some recognition.
We're watching David Splane's talk at the 2021 annual meeting, his title, The Way of Holiness. And this is the part for me where his talk starts to get really disingenuous and quite inappropriate. What he's doing is he is appropriating characters from history and suggesting that they were somehow early Jehovah's Witnesses. That's roughly what he's doing here. As I mentioned earlier, all of this is based on a verse in Isaiah that describes a way of holiness, which David Splane has explained to be the road, the literal road from Babylon to the Promised Land, gradually getting easier as more Jews made that journey home. They would make it easier for those who would follow. He's using that as an analogy for Jehovah's Witnesses, and he's now pointing to figures from history who were not Jehovah's Witnesses. Let's be very clear on that. He's pointing to figures from history. He's name-dropping, cherry-picking favourable characters and suggesting, well, this William Tyndale, or Tyndale as he describes, this William Tyndale was effectively an early Jehovah's Witness. We're going to appropriate him into our whole movement. It's kind of a shady practice to be doing that with dead people, isn't it? I mean, imagine once you're dead, let's just imagine that I were to die and in the future, some cult were to spring up with certain ideas that could be construed as mirroring mine in some way. And they had all sorts of abusive practices. They were ruining families. They were covering up abuse. They were doing all of these various things. I'm trying to imagine how I would feel if in one of their talks or if in their literature, they justified their organization based on something that I'd said or based on some ideas that I've mentioned on my YouTube channel. And because I'm dead, hypothetically speaking, I wouldn't be in a position to say anything, would I? I wouldn't be in a position to object because I'm dead. So what he's doing is incredibly inappropriate if you think about it. It's kind of dishonoring the memory of William Tyndale to be suggesting that he was effectively an early Jehovah's Witness. And make no mistake, he wasn't. If he hadn't been executed, let's say he'd been teleported at the moment of his execution, just before he was killed, let's say he'd been teleported to the year 2021 and he was with us now, and let's say he sat down for an interview and was asked to talk about his religious views. Would be challenging because he'd be speaking in Shakespearean English, but I think we'd understand that we'd get the gist of what he's saying. He'd be coming out with a whole bunch of views and ideas that are polar opposite to the Jehovah's Witness religion. And even in areas in which there is some kind of alignment, such as David Splane citing that thing about Jehovah, that doesn't mean that William Tyndale acknowledges the faithful slave. That doesn't mean that William Tyndale accepts that in 1919, Jesus invisibly chose Watchtower officials, Joseph Rutherford and his associates, to be faithful and discreet slave 1.0, an authority that's been inherited by David Splane and his associates. You have to believe that if you're not going to be an apostate, if you're going to be a Jehovah's Witness. And if William Tyndale doesn't believe that, which he doesn't or didn't, because he couldn't have, then he's not a Jehovah's Witness. And what happens to people who aren't Jehovah's Witnesses when Armageddon comes? They get destroyed. They get killed. If William Tyndale were alive today, he'd better accept David Splane's authority over him, or he'd be annihilated. So quite apart from speaking for the dead, it's incredibly inappropriate and disingenuous for David Splane to be name-dropping in this way, cherry-picking figures from history that suit his narrative. Incredibly disingenuous, and we're not done yet, because he's got some more examples for us.
About 1835, a Bible student by the name of Henry Grew wrote a pamphlet on the immortality of the soul. And in that pamphlet, Grew explained from the Bible that immortality is a reward for faithfulness. We're not born with it. Now, he published the tract anonymously because he knew there'd be trouble. And later on, there was trouble for Henry Grew. Well, he publishes a tract, but 2 years later, another Bible student, George Storrs, is riding in a train, and he looks down and he sees a tract there, and it's Henry Grew's tract on the immortality of the soul. He reads it, and he becomes convinced that man doesn't have an immortal soul. So what does he do? He picks up a shovel, and he starts working on the road, the way of holiness. In 1842, he gave a series of lectures on the intriguing theme, Are the Wicked Immortal? And he later published those lectures. Do you know how many copies were produced? 200,000 copies of that series of lectures. So that was decent road work on that way of holiness. Well, Storrs knew that he didn't have the whole truth on every subject. And in 1847, he made quite an interesting statement. It'd be interesting for us. He says, "We do well to remember that we have just emerged from the dark ages of the church. And notice this, it would not be strange if we should find some Babylonish garments still worn by us. Well, he was right. Babylon still had influence in those days. Well, we know that George Storrs had an influence on Charles Taze Russell. And what do we know about Brother Russell and his associates? They weren't the first to discover that the Trinity and the immortality of the soul are false doctrines, or even that Christ's presence would be invisible to the human eye. They benefited from the careful preparatory work that other road workers had done in the past. So, translators, printers, and Bible students were doing spiritual sight work. And we might say that Brother Russell and his associates put the final touches on that way of holiness.
He's doing it again, isn't he? He's hijacking, he's commandeering the memory of non-Jehovah's Witnesses who were around before Jehovah's Witnesses were even a thing, and he's suggesting that they were somehow early Jehovah's Witnesses. These men are dead. These men cannot speak for themselves. If they were here now, they'd probably be condemned by Jehovah's Witnesses, or at least it's likely that their views would not align with Jehovah's Witness views in some way, making them condemned at Armageddon. And yet their names are being invoked as somehow lending credibility to this vile David Splane character, who wants you to believe that the efforts of people like William Tyndale, Henry Grew, and George Storrs were all leading to him, were all leading to the governing body arrangement and their authority as being the channel of communication between God and mankind. It's so slimy and shady, isn't it? And what's fascinating is, quite apart from the fact that, again, these men were not Jehovah's Witnesses, it's interesting when you actually dig down and learn more about these characters. I found it interesting when David Splane says,
and what do we know about Brother Russell and his associates?
Yes, what do we know, David Splane? What do we know about Brother Russell and his associates? What are Jehovah's Witnesses allowed to know? Because let's face it, you tell them what they're allowed to know about Brother Russell. You tell them, you spoon feed them their history. You select what quotes from Brother Russell should be shown, and which of Brother Russell's words Jehovah's Witnesses are allowed to have access to. What publications of Brother Russell are Jehovah's Witnesses allowed to read for themselves on jw.org? Name one. It's so shady the way that the organization uses the history in this way and presents this whitewashed version. And in the case of Henry Grew and George Storrs, it's easy to unravel this whole narrative of them being early Jehovah's Witnesses. Interestingly, when you look up the Wikipedia page on Henry Grew, allow me to read a portion. Grew was invited to the World Anti-Slavery Convention beginning 12th of June 1840 in London. I'm going to skip a paragraph. Before and during the convention, there was fierce debate about the participation and seating of women delegates and attendees. Grew sided with the British organisers and spoke in favour of the men's right to exclude women, despite his daughter also being excluded. In 1854, a similar public debate took place when Grew and Mary attended the 5th Annual National Women's Rights Convention in Philadelphia. Grew debated with Lucretia Mott, during which he lauded the supremacy and authority of men. What a charming character. You know what, David Splane? You can have him. I don't agree with your logic that Henry Grew was a Jehovah's Witness, but if you really want a man like that to be a Jehovah's Witness, well, he's a prime candidate, isn't he? At least in terms of his misogyny and his view of women, he would fit right in, wouldn't he? As an elder or as a governing body member. Not suggesting all elders have that view, by the way, but certainly it's an incredibly sexist, patriarchal organisation, and someone like Henry Grew would fit right in. As for George Storrs, as I point out in my book, The Reluctant Apostate, quick plug, it is my channel after all. There's my book, The Reluctant Apostate, and I devote, I think, 2 or 3 chapters to the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I talk about George Storrs because, quite interestingly, and this is something they don't tell you, this is something David Splane won't tell you, even though he probably knows. Interestingly, there was a spat between George Storrs and Charles Taze Russell shortly before George Storrs' death. So, as we saw there, George Storrs died in 1879. That's what it said in the caption. In 1877, so 2 years before George Storrs' death, Charles Taze Russell sponsored the publication of a book titled 3 Worlds. So 3 Worlds, you can actually find a PDF of it. It was a book by Nelson Barber that was essentially bankrolled by Charles Taze Russell, because Charles Taze Russell and Nelson Barber were at that time working together for a brief period. Charles Taze Russell was a co-editor for Nelson Barber's magazine, Herald of the Morning. And Charles Taze Russell sponsored Nelson Barber's book, 3 Worlds, which predicted the second coming of Jesus, you're going to love this, for April 6th, 1878. So April 6th, bear in mind, the book was published in 1877, so they weren't giving themselves much time. They were predicting for only the following year from the book's publication for the second coming of Christ. Pretty bold, wasn't it? And George Storrs did a very brief review. Let's read part of it, shall we? This is from the Bible Examiner of July 1877, which was George Storrs' paper. Think of the Bible Examiner as the Watchtower magazine of George Storrs. So George Storrs says in the Bible Examiner, I received a copy of the above work some time since and have read it with care, portions of it several times. It contains much of interest which may be read with profit. The chronology is the best I have ever seen, but it is impossible for me to assent to all the conclusions the writer has arrived at as to the events, yet I feel no disposition to oppose his views by way of controversy. A few months will determine the accuracy of the ground he has taken as to the withdrawal of the saints from the earth. Bear in mind, again, he was writing in July 1877, and the second coming of Christ had been predicted for April 6th, 1878. So he was taking the very reasonable view, look, I'm not really down with the predictions necessarily, but hey, in a few months, we'll see whether it's true or not. Apparently, this didn't go down well with Charles Taze Russell, who again had bankrolled the 3 Worlds publication. He didn't write it, he was behind it though. And apparently in Herald of the Morning, Charles Taze Russell replied and wasn't very happy. We don't know exactly what Charles Taze Russell said, because I haven't yet seen a PDF of the article in question, but we know it exists because George Storrs replied in his magazine, The Bible Examiner. Here is the relevant quote from the October 1877 magazine. My criticism, so apparently Charles Taze Russell had accused him of being critical. Actually, it was quite a generous review if you think about it. The chronology is the best I have ever seen. This wasn't good enough for Charles Taze Russell, apparently. My criticism on the above-named work in the July Examiner has called forth a reply by my esteemed brother, Charles T. Russell, in the Herald of the Morning. I understand that Dr. Barber, its editor, does fix definitely the time of the translation of the elect church. He tells us we are in the time of the harvest now, and that sometime in this period the elect are to be translated. In other words, raptured. Yet he does not pretend to know the exact day. But does he not say it will be at or before the harvest ends? And does he not say it ends the 9th day of April next? He may admit it is possible the elect may be translated any time before that day, but suppose they are not, what then? Will they not know the day exactly in which they are to be changed at that day? And would any of them, with that knowledge, be in the field or in the mill at work, as our Lord tells us they will be when they are taken? I object to the time setting in any limited period, because I believe it is a disregard of our Lord's teaching on the subject, and the disappointments of the past, I think, should teach us it is an error to attempt to do more than to show the return of our Lord from heaven is near, even at the door, and learn to watch and pray that we may be ready at all times to meet him. But no argument that I have ever seen since 1844 has had any effect on my mind to cause me to believe the precise time of the second advent is revealed in the Bible or will be known, unless God gives a new and direct revelation on the subject, which he may or may not, for all that is known. What a reasonable position. If you think about it, this has aged incredibly well. Bear in mind, George Storrs was a follower of William Miller. William Miller had predicted the second coming for 1843 and then 1844, which is why George Storrs mentions 1844, and he uses the word disappointment because 1844 went down in history as the great disappointment. People were expecting the second coming. People were expecting to be raptured, and it didn't happen. And George Storrs is here saying, you know what? Enough of this date setting. I mean, you do that if that suits you. But I feel as though my experience of expectation being failed, of predictions failing, informs me that it's an unwise course. We shouldn't need to do that. There is no date. Let's just be content to be Christians, is the message George Storrs is giving there to Charles Taze Russell. And yet notice how David Splane characterizes George Storrs.
Well, Storrs knew that he didn't have the whole truth on every subject. Well, we know that George Storrs had an influence on Charles Taze Russell.
Apparently, George Storrs didn't have enough of an influence on Charles Taze Russell. Actually, David Splane, I think the facts will attest. And as for Storrs knew that he didn't have the whole truth on every subject, he certainly had a lot more truth and wisdom than Charles Taze Russell. Let's be crystal clear on that. If only Charles Taze Russell had listened to George Storrs back then in 1877 2 years before the Watchtower started to be printed. If only Charles Taze Russell had taken on board some of this wisdom and some of this pragmatism and some of this, whoa, hold on a minute now, let's not put words in the mouths of the Bible writers. Let's not spin scriptures to point to certain years. Let's just be content to be Christians. If only Charles Taze Russell had been influenced more by George Storrs, maybe we wouldn't be in this mess. But it's incredibly disingenuous to, again, hijack the memory of George Storrs, who, again, was not a Jehovah's Witness, and point to George Storrs as being on the highway of holiness or one of the builders of the highway of holiness, when in fact, if anything, George Storrs was here at least condemning precisely the doomsday date setting, the obsession with the end times and Armageddon and judgment that continues to blight the organization to this day.